Hello, everybody. I'm watching everybody come in here. That number go up. Give it a second here while people start to join. Okay, we'll get going. Hello, everyone. Happy New Year, and welcome back to the Arts Funders Forum Remake the Model conversation series. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Melissa Cowley-Wolf. I'm the director of the Arts Funders Forum and the founder of MCW Projects. We are excited to announce that this 2023 series is supported by Kickstarter. We are grateful for their support and their partnership on this endeavor. So to recap AFF, because we were on sabbatical for a year, and to introduce this platform to new audiences who are with us today. AFF was conceived by advisory firm M+D and launched in 2018 to shape the future of cultural philanthropy by increasing private support for arts and culture. We are an advocacy, media, convening, and research platform designed to develop new models of impact-driven financial support for the cultural sector. And we do this by bringing together engaged philanthropists, funders, artists, cultural leaders, and experts like all of you on this call today. This series, Remake the Model, consists of virtual and in-person conversations, which are designed to develop new funding models that will support the arts through large-scale economic, political, socio transformations, and inspire the next generation of philanthropists. We launched this platform in 2018 against a backdrop of the largest intergenerational wealth transfer in history, and had no idea what the next few years would bring. Simultaneously, we've been seeing next era supporters turn away from the arts and also witnessing a decline in arts giving. So this is a massive problem to solve. We all need to do together. And we at AFF want to be a part of that and help solve it. So we do this all in partnership with you, a growing community of over 5,000 individuals from across the globe. We also have an incredible advisory board of leaders from the cultural, philanthropy, technology, and business sectors. So I want to thank you all very much. This first talk of 2023 centers around the book, Museum Metamorphosis, Cultivating Change Through Cultural Citizenship. I am honored that I've been invited to contribute to that book, and I'm thrilled to be joined today by the book's author, Nico Whedon, and two of my fellow contributors, Shawnda Chapman and Ruby Lerner. Nico convened the three of us ladies in a roundtable discussion 2 years ago this month, and the resulting chapter in the book is titled Museum as Stakeholder, How to Retool the Funding Landscape and Invest in a Social Change Ecosystem. So this is our reunion today. We have not all four been together since then, so I hope you'll kindly indulge our enthusiasm about being back together. I want to share and pull up on the screen here information about the book as we get started, for those of you who haven't seen it. Museum Metamorphosis features over 40 cultural innovators and change makers in contemporary art, and to share strategies on building sociocultural relevancy and responsiveness in museums. Representing diverse perspectives from the entire arts and culture ecosystem, this book offers tools to shape museums and cultural organizations into collaborative platforms for collective impact and social change. Compiled during a moment of heightened social action, cultural transformation, and institutional critique, Museum Metamorphosis continues and responds to the most pressing issues facing the industry today. As I said, I'm honored to be a part of this group. These are the faces and the folks who contributed to the book, over 40 individuals from across the ecosystem that Nico pulled together in a variety of ways, which we'll speak about in a little bit, the methodology of the book. I encourage you all to check it out if you have not already. We will be sharing a link, and it was in the invitation of how to purchase the book. And it's just an incredible series of conversations. So today's conversation will cover the critiques and the actionable solutions to advance our ecosystem, especially within the philanthropic system. So Nika, Shawnda, Ruby, and I will revisit our roundtable, pick up where we left off, and offer solutions to the ongoing issues of developing equitable, democratic, sustainable arts funding structures, especially relating to power and leadership. So just a couple small topics. So let me introduce these three speakers with us today. Nico Whedon is the author of Museum Metamorphosis, is an independent arts consultant, curator, educator, and writer based in New Haven, Connecticut. She is also the founder and principal of the Building Fund, LLC, a visiting critic at Yale School of Art, and a board member at the National Academy of Design and the Arts Council of Greater New Haven. As an advocate for BIPOC and women artists in all endeavors, she uses her myriad platforms to deepen the canon of contemporary art while cultivating an engaged community of practice. As a consultant, Nico delivers cultural strategy to artists, entrepreneurs, cultural institutions, government agencies, and philanthropic foundations. Her approach is informed by her unique perspective as a practitioner working across sectors. Up next for Nico, she's going to be guest curating 2 open calls exhibitions in New Haven. One is called Made Visible, Freedom Dreams at the Creative Arts Workshop on view February 1 through March 18, and an open call exhibition at the Eli Center of Contemporary Art, which will run March 12th through April 30th. Shawnda Chapman is the Director of Innovative Grantmaking and Research at the Ms. Foundation for Women, where she leads 2 major grantmaking initiatives, the Artist Collaboration and Care Fund and the Girls of Color Initiative. The ACF seeks to deepen collaboration across movement building organizations, learn with movement leaders, and increase investment in social justice movements across the country. The Girls of Color Initiative addresses the multitude of inequity faced by girls and TGNC youth of color by providing grant-making, leadership development, and capacity building resources. Shawnda is working on a follow-up study to the Foundation's seminal research report entitled Pocket Change: How Women of Color Do More with Less, which examine women of color's experiences with philanthropy, particularly around attracting and retaining resources and the ways that scarce funding landscapes are contributing to a crisis of burnout. Shawnda is also pursuing her doctorate from the Graduate Center at CUNY, City University of New York, and her research focuses on understanding the impact of philanthropic disinvestment on leaders, organizations, and movements led and for women and non-binary people of color. Last but not least, Ruby Lerner is the founding executive director of Creative Capital, a foundation that adapts venture capital concepts to support individual artists. Under her leadership, Creative Capital committed more than $40 million in financial and advisory support to over 500 projects representing over 600 artists, which helped those artists leverage nearly $100 million in additional support. Since 2018, she served as an advisor to the Arts Exchange Program of the Open Society Foundation, assisting in the design of a new fellowship program for international artists. She is also a consultant to the Soros International Arts Fellowship at the Open Society Institute. And Ruby lends her expertise as a member of the advisory board to New Ink at the New Museum, and she's on the boards of iBeam, Light Industry, and the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, among many others. Next up for Ruby is her archive project, a forthcoming website with her writing and speaking since the early 80s will launch in the spring, and there'll be conversations, podcasts, and more scheduled around that launch. Ruby, we cannot wait. So for our program today, I'll speak with our 3 guests one-on-one, and then we'll come together for group discussion. This will include audience participation through questions, so please submit your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box, but the Q&A box for that section of the talk. And our aim is to leave this conversation with solid takeaways to use for change. So I'm going to stop talking, and I'd like to introduce our first guest, the author of Museum Metamorphosis, Nico Whedon. Nico, thank you for being here with us today. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
It's so great to see you. Congratulations again on this book.
Thank you. Yeah, it's almost pushing up on a year of being in the world, so it's feeling very, very real.
Happy birthday.
Yeah, thanks.
So let's jump in. I need like 2 hours with you, but we'll start here. In the introduction to the book, you write, the museum industrial complex is at a critical juncture. In mounting public distrust and governance, widespread movements that seek to redress historic injustices, and the prevailing work culture of museums, a popular desire for change is evident. This provocation is not to negate individual strides made by museums within the ecosystem over the years. Rather, it is to assert that the entire ecosystem itself is ripe for change and that this metamorphosis will be no greater than the sum of its parts. You brilliantly continue to write about issues like relevance, equity, community building, sustainability, so much more. So for this book, you interviewed over 40 folks. You contextualized those conversations within our moment so beautifully, and it was not easy to do that over the last couple of years where things were changing every day. Your book is very solution oriented, which we love. So, can you tell us some of the biggest key takeaways for change that you got out of the book as you were witnessing these conversations and these interviews?
Sure. Whew, change. I mean, such a big topic. Yeah, so it's a lot of reflection that I've been doing, especially as this book approaches a year in the world, and we've been touring around and having conversations at different scale organizations in the region. Um, and so there's three that I'll share today, but I don't want to diminish the sense that I've just learned so much over talking with people the last year about the book. So the first thing I'd say is really that, like, in order for change to stand a chance, and by change I mean, the kind of systemic change that we're talking about, we first really have to understand what the actual issues are, and what the forces are that are working against change in our sector. And so thinking about how white supremacy and patriarchy shows up in the museum field specifically, we could write a whole book on that alone. And so I think, acknowledging that women, people of color, non-binary communities have been really left out of those spaces of structural power, where we're talking about analyzing and triaging the issues, and then also designing and making decisions around how to solve them. And so I think what we see as a result is, we're either building our own institutions, or we're working from inside an ailing system to really try and affect the change from within. I say either or, but I'm definitely a both and. In my work as a consultant, I'm definitely on the outside, where I've also worked on the inside, working to affect the change at different paces. And so I think, what the book does, and what I'm continuing to see the book do, is to really position us at the center of analyzing what the actual problem is. And again, expanding this beyond a museum specific conversation, beyond even a sector specific conversation, and thinking about institutions and societies more broadly. Second, I would say, and a lot of this, is borrowed from the lessons that I take from reading Adrienne Marie Brown, which everyone should do. Is that, change is like a daily practice, right? It's happening all around us. It's happening on a spectrum of scales. It's happening within individuals and also within institutions. And so I think learning to see and understand those as equal, right? Like, as, the work that a person is doing internally in order to shift, both their actions and their rhetoric towards justice is just as important as, the kind of broader social movements that carry that change to the collective and to the people. And so I would say a thing I've definitely learned is that, change is happening everywhere. Whether or not we're able and trained to perceive it is something else. And so I think learning and training ourselves to see change, especially change that, we're not a part of. I think when our hands are in the pot, we kind of understand, but when we're looking, from a bird's eye view, it takes a real training around seeing and observing, learning to see it so that we can also see where it's not, or where it's static. And so, I think, what the book tries to do is use the case study format to really uplift and celebrate these concrete examples of folks driving, institution and institutional advancement within the sector. And then I think the last thing I'd say, which is probably like a mantra of mine that I say to myself at night when I can't sleep, is like, don't bet all your money on like actually witnessing the change that you want to see transpire within your lifetime, right? So understanding the nature of change as incremental, working to identify like your capacity, but also, your role, and like what you're capable of in a given moment, given the world and its continued rotation, and really just chipping away at it, with patience. And I would refer everyone to Deepa Iyer, who's an amazing writer, lawyer, activist, who provides a lot of tools to help really kind of place yourself within this social change ecosystem, but to also kind of better understand how to map your role in relation to other people. So those are three big takeaways. There's like minutia that we'll probably get to in the group chat.
Thank you. And one of the things I love about how you frame the book is you do say a number of times that change is slow.
Yeah.
And so while you're featuring folks talking about what change needs to be made and tools for making that change, you do say it's not going to happen overnight, which
Right.
we get antsy because we want it to happen overnight on every front, and it's not. And I think that's a really wonderful reminder in the book, which is like, here are the tools, but be patient. and take care of yourself through advocating for that change, because otherwise it's not going to happen.
Totally. Yeah.
Um, you have a really cool methodology for the book. You have the part one includes 7 roundtables, which Ruby, Shawnda, and I were one of, where you say we emote, we listen, we question, we rant, we preach, we cuss, and we give gratitude. Yes.
We did all those things.
Love it. Part two, you have 4 case studies where you're encouraging organizations to decenter their perceived authority over the arts and ecosystem and embrace cross-sector collaboration and community partnership. Yes. And you have part 3, which is interviews with field leaders who share strategies for addressing the structural challenge of today while building inroads towards a more equitable future. And they expand upon the topics that you feature in the first part. So the roundtable section is called Dialogues on Decentralization. And the one that you did with Shawnda, Ruby, and myself was called Museum as Stakeholder. And it was the last chapter of the first part. And in the introduction to the chapter, you write about the conversations you've previously had. The more we questioned the systems that emboldened museums to perpetuate practices of cultural exclusion and erasure, the closer we arrived at a shared sense of the root issue, that the nonprofit industrial complex to which most museums, and I'll say cultural organizations, belong is flawed by design. From its top-heavy governance structures to its dependence on philanthropy in a highly precarious and segmented market, the nonprofit sector is ripe for redesign. So the question, with philanthropy being all about power, what tools have been articulated throughout your research and this book to shift the power dynamic to create more democratic and grassroots models for fundraising? So small question.
Yeah, I know, right? So yeah, I'm going to shout out one of my mentors, Ruby Lerner, who I think talks about this really eloquently in the book as, diffusing the power of any one person or institution through the collective. I think it's a strategy, right? I don't think it's the solution. I think it's a strategy. I believe in it. And, I tie it to this kind of sustainability question, which I think you talk about a lot in your work. So yeah, it's like, if we're all bought in, both like economically, emotionally, spiritually, then I do think that we're actually making kind of collective strides towards this more democratic model. And so I think, for me, it's less about like shifting power from A to B or B to C, because I don't see power as scarce in that way. Like, I think it's something that, again, we're trained to perceive as being scarce. But I think it's abundant, right? And I'm equating money and power, but I don't mean to make that, the only kind of instance. So again, I think it's about training ourselves to see value in A, B, and C, but also understanding that like not all value has a dollar sign in front of it, right? And that there's different metrics of measuring what that value is. And, under the umbrella of capitalism, that's like more than a notion to actually succeed at doing, but I think it's an exercise. And then I would also say, because I'm like less interested in dragging unwilling folks to the table anymore, I think I have done that in my life and I'm tired now. I think philanthropy has to want to change itself, and I think in some places it really does. I think Shawnda, can't see you, but I'm looking at you. Just thinking about the care, but also like the innovation, the Black feminist lens, the rigor that you bring to philanthropy through your work at the Ms. Foundation is really evidence of, a part of the system changing. I've also been really excited to see like more significant, direct support to artists. And again, like, thanking Ruby for your influence in that kind of space. But also in the change that you've brought just in terms of, bringing an abundance mindset to thinking about how we talk about money in the nonprofit sector, and also bringing best practices from venture capital and other places that, we're again trained not to see and understand as valuable in our situation. And then Melissa, I think it's, like I just look at your work and I think about, and your work is like the exact opposite of my work, right? Like I think you're really keen eye for like data and your ability to kind of analyze with that data and forecast what a future sustainability looks like, for our sector, I think is just really rich and really important. And I would love to see more folks working through your kind of methodology. And so in terms of like concrete tools, what I would say, capital P philanthropy is going to do what it's going to do. I think a tool that we all have at our disposal is resistance. And interpret that as you will, but I think resisting movement capture, don't sell your mission, don't sell, the values behind your work, and resisting mission drift, like at all costs, right? I think building a program that's relevant to your mission, that directly and impactfully serves audiences, sticking to it, doing it well. I think that's the way. And I think in this new model that we're envisioning, the people will find you, and then the money will follow the people. And so that's the vision. There's plenty more tools to get us there, but I think those are a couple.
Thank you for that. And yes, Ruby and Shawnda, we're going to be jumping into this with them, a lot of the stuff that you mentioned. Thank you for that. Last question before we go to Shawnda and then our group is the framework. You discuss a framework in the book, restructuring museums into people-powered spaces. Can you speak more about this need for people-powered spaces and name some institutions and or leaders, perhaps based on your case studies, that are engaged in this shift?
Yeah. So I think for me, it all goes back to this notion of cultural citizenship, and our right to belong, but also to be represented by and within our public institutions. And so from where I sit, and I think people have different experiences of this, but from where I sit, I don't see this or feel this as the status quo yet. So it's we're either going to have to build it, or we're going to have to demand it, or both. So yeah, I think it's about being stronger together, the strength of the collective, but also prioritizing our needs, like public needs over private interests. That's what that's what people power means to me. And so in the book, I kind of talk about this through the lens of these for us by us institutions. And some examples of those are the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Laundromat Project, the Black School, the Beautiful Project. These are all kind of examples that are deeply explored in the book. And so the way I kind of understand the power of those spaces is, the legacies of leadership. So it's not just who's in power in this particular moment, but it's the lineage of amazing, mostly women of color that have led these organizations and brought innovation to the sector through the work they're doing in these for us by us spaces. And so there's that on the one hand, and then on the other hand, there's the work that the communities of those organizations do to animate the mission, but to also hold those organizations accountable to the mission and to doing what they say that they're going to do. So that's how I see and understand it. Yeah, I think that answers. I don't know.
I think that was great. Thank you.
Okay.
Nico, thank you so much. We'll see you in a little bit for the group discussion. Thank you for this.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you again for putting this book in the world, man. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, so next I will chat with Shawnda Chapman. Wait for Shawnda to come up here. There she is. Hi, Shawnda. Thank you for being here with us today.
Oh, the pleasure is actually all mine. I feel
fun.
like I got invited to the coolest party, and how did I get here?
It's only cool because you're here, girl. It's true. It's true.
But gratitude to Nico, though. Nico, thank you for this really fabulous piece of scholarship, and for Melissa for bringing us all together again.
Thank you. Well, I want to jump in and ask you about your role at the Miss Foundation. So you come to this role from research, policy, and movement work. And in our roundtable discussion for the book, you called yourself an activist philanthropist, and that is the tool you're using to impact change you want to see done in the world. So leveraging your movement work, tell us what activist philanthropist means to you.
So I guess for me, at its least common denominator, it means that I am accountable to the leaders, to the organizations, and to the movements that we support. First, because I am them. And secondly, because we share a commitment to creating change and to disrupting systems of oppression. I recognize that I have a very specific role in the social change ecosystem. And sometimes that feels really distant from the work that social justice leaders and that artists do. But I view myself in struggle with them and for the good of all of us. And for me, that has really specific implications, not for just the work that I do, but also the way that I do that work. You know, it means that I have to have a commitment to identifying and challenging disparities and power differentials, both in my own work and in the field. It means that I can't, you know, just simply be satisfied with moving resources and yes, ultimately, you know, secure the bag, as the young people say. But I have to do that in a way that recognizes the dignity and the autonomy and the humanity of the people and the organizations that we support. And I think lastly, you know, my personal orientation to the work says that we always have to be giving more than we take. And that starts by recognizing, you know, and Nico alluded to this, to sort of understanding the ways that we actually take, you know, and then really start to reimagining, you know, sort of reimagine the ways that we do that work in a holistic way instead of a transactional one.
That's beautiful. Thank you. So true. We need a grant maker like you in every organization. I want to talk with you in your role as grant maker about capacity building and financial literacy. And these were two big topics of our roundtable conversation for the book. You said in the book that the lack of financial literacy is causing individuals and organizations to fail, being crushed under the weight of bureaucratic requirements, especially in places where people are simply struggling to exist. So, how do you mitigate this in your work at the foundation? And what are some lessons for this for the grant makers across the sectors in this conversation?
Yeah, it's such a big question, and I'm really glad that you asked it. You know, when we first had our discussion, I just started at the foundation. In fact, I was new to philanthropy, and you know, I couldn't help but notice the really glaring ways that leaders themselves and the organizations that they were supporting were suffering both from skills gaps and from critical infrastructure support. And this is an individual level observation. You know, in the years since, I've developed a more nuanced understanding, I think, of the problem, which is for me, that the problem itself is actually structural, while our solutions are individual. You know, for me, the underlying logic of capacity building programs is often, you know, leader, organization, artist. If we could just get you more skills, you'd do better. Instead, I argue now, philanthropy, if we could just get you more skills, you know, leaders could do better, artists could do better. You know, we're really ignoring the structural factors that exert influence on the success of our grantees. You know, things like years, in fact, generations of philanthropic disinvestment, you know, things like just having to figure it out when your counterparts have had years of development, years of support, years of mentorship, you know, things like deciding between infrastructure and programming, and you just cannot ignore those things. At the same time, it remains true that people often need access to those sorts of supports if they're going to be successful. At the Miss Foundation, we began to try to pull apart that rubber band ball and mitigate this in our work in a couple of ways. First, I have a brilliant colleague. Her name is Samantha Franklin, and she has developed a capacity building program that has both a la carte options, you know, with trainings and learnings based on the things that our grantees have said that they need. But we also offer general operating dollars so that grantees can sort of customize supports in the ways that they want to do it. But secondly, and sort of to your expertise, Melissa, we've started to use our institutional capacity to commission research to better understand their needs and their experiences. You know, especially the ways that the philanthropic sector impacts the successes and the failures of our grantees. You know, so if we're committed to things like pay equity, we should understand that landscape, you know, for the people that we support. You know, we should know what percentage of people have access to things like health insurance. You know, what percentage of people can afford a sabbatical? You know, how many women, artists and leaders have care responsibilities that impact their ability to show up to work? You know, what percentage of leaders are facing housing insecurity? You know, I read a thing the other day that was talking about our ability to survive, right? And it was just talking about the ways that living in survival mode constricts our ability to be innovative. You know, you never actually get to be your best self because you're so focused on surviving. And so as people who are resourcing movements, resourcing artists, we sort of have to expand our philanthropic lens to sort of think beyond, you know, the usual supports that we're giving.
That's beautiful. That is so true. And it relates to something else I wanted to bring up with you, which is that at the Ms. Foundation, you pulled together a cohort of organizations that work for girls, partnering directly with them and compensating them for their work. And in our roundtable, you said that the tendency to lean on folks in the grassroots to tell us what to do, but act like it's a privilege for them to be able to be in conversation with us, which is a big statement. Shifting the power like this, and what you just mentioned previously, shifting the power like this and listening and trusting the specialists in the field is the key to this philanthropic metamorphosis, right? And trust-based philanthropy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Whew, that one, you're right. It's a big one. I hear it all the time. And you know, this is the thing about actually coming from community, being in community. People will tell you things that they may not have the luxury to talk to, you know, other funders about, and they'll tell you the truth, you know, about the ways that they feel like the funding is transactional. You know, they will tell you that they feel, you know, many of the people feel like they for example, I did some interviews with some grantees recently for some funding, and I only scheduled interviews with people that I intended to support, you know, and I had to tell them that at the top of these conversations, and I can't tell you how often that invoked tears, where people just started crying when we were like, "Oh, this is not a conversation for decision making. The decision has been made. We want to be in relationship with you," and people talked about how they often had to sell themselves, you know, and had to prove that they were good enough, and what a toll that was taking. You know, so I think, Melissa, at some point we just have to get comfortable with the fact that our old way of working, even if unintentionally, perpetuates harm and inequality. And then we have to change it. You know, we have to resource holistically. We have to support things like rest. We should, in fact, be seeing wellness as a movement strategy itself. You know, we joked offline, you know, about this need for a vibe shift, right? And that's what it is. It's a complete, total, you know, vibe shift. It's a paradigm shift, you know, that understands that the real philanthropic metamorphosis sees and respects social change leaders and artists for what they actually are, you know, the dreamers and the architects of the world that we want to live in. You know, they are the wayfinders, the rememberers, they are the holders of the sacred. They have grand visions for change. Yet, you know, we don't resource them like we trust them to do the job that they're actually doing for us. You know, one of our grantees said in an interview that I had recently, it's like you're planning a cross-country trip, but you're only ever given an eighth a tank of gas at a time. And we just have to do better than that.
Perfectly said. Thank you so much. We'll see you in a few minutes. I'm going to pick up on a lot of what you mentioned in terms of wellness and care, because I'm shifting my work in that direction. I think that's going to be the focus of the years, integrating everything for the last couple of years, decades, into a practice of wellness and care in a really holistic way. So thank you so much, Shawnda. We'll see you in a little bit. Next up, I'm going to speak with Ruby Lerner. Give her a second here. Ruby, hi.
Hi, how are you? Don't you feel like the future's in good hands when you hear Nico?
When I'm with you three, yeah. When I'm with you three, absolutely.
Before
Thank you
we
so much.
start, I just have to do another plug for the book. So I don't know if this book's a bestseller yet or not, because I've bought like dozens of copies to give to friends, particularly friends who are on the boards of museums. And I think it's such an important book. Nico, thank you so much for this this really important work. I think it does have the potential, if people really take it seriously, for transformation.
Agree. And I'm going to make sure that the link to purchase the book is in the chat. I don't know if I can chat the whole group, but I'm I'm putting the link here if someone in our team can put that in there, but it's included in the invite and it'll be included in the follow-up email, but thank you. Yes, it should be, it sits right here, all marked up with tabs and highlighting everything for everything I do. Thank you. Okay, so Ruby, I want to jump in because I want to make sure we all have time to come together here at the end. But the threads through what I just discussed with Nico and Shawnda really culminate in a lot of things you said in the book. And you speak so eloquently and honestly in the book about your leadership transition from creative capital to independent advisory work and about those transitions in general. And you speak of life cycle, you speak of ceding power, separating power from stature. I'm going to say that again, separating power from stature, and making space for the next generation of leadership, cultivating that next gen by stepping into a different kind of role in the community. In our discussion for the book, you noted a concern about transitions, which I found brilliant, that in the stepping aside to help dismantle white supremacy within our ecosystem, that very slowly people with resources, the same people who need to move aside, would stop investing in organizations as they begin to lose power in the leadership. So our industry, like all other industries, the sharing, the expansion, and the transition of power does not come easily and inhibits the desired metamorphosis that we are discussing. I'm hoping you can share your story, your process of your transition, how the board at Cultural Creative Capital partnered with you in this, and why it's important to do the internal work to make these shifts.
Yeah, I think I will just say, that has been my fear about these transitions organizationally that are being made that are so necessary and way overdue. I hope it won't be the reality. I want to be more hopeful than I said it in the book. For me personally, there were of course a lot of factors that came into play. Main ones were age and time. I was about 68. I'd been at Creative Capital for close to 17 years. That's enough. It was time to pass it on with joy and with a lot of pride. But there's another factor that has come up, and I think that Shawnda really just honed in on so brilliantly. And that is the economic dimension. I had, for the first time in my career, a decent salary when I was at Creative Capital, because I'm not even going to tell you what I was making before the Creative Capital job, because it's just too embarrassing. I had negotiated for myself a good severance agreement. I had saved the maximum in my 401k all those years. And very importantly, I had been able to create a very generous for a nonprofit match for 401k contributions for the entire staff. So I was able to retire. We don't talk about these things. These are indelicate things to talk about. We've got to start talking about it, because one of the things that makes it hard for a lot of older people to leave their jobs is that many nonprofit arts jobs don't pay well, and we don't have good retirement benefits, if any. None of the organizations I ran before Creative Capital, at the time I ran them, had retirement programs, none of them. We don't talk about a life of making, the economics of making a life in the nonprofit arts. But as part of all of our conversations about equity, we really have to have that conversation too. Many of our organizations, quite honestly, I think if we step back, we would have to say, and I think Shawnda really pointed to this, they're not economically viable. They are operating only through the subsidized labor of their staff. This is not sustainable. I've just recently had two incredibly troubling conversations with people, with women, I'll get specific, whose work has been field defining. They've been at it for years. They are not young anymore, and they have virtually nothing saved for their futures. How is this okay? This is untenable, and it's something nobody wants to talk about. I'm personally haunted by it, because if it hadn't been for CC, I would be in exactly that same boat. So another thing, that is something that I think philanthropy really needs to begin to address in a very deep and honest way. We are killing people in these organizations, literally. Another thing that happened for me that's a lovely thing is that my incredible board members, a sort of small group, came to me and offered to meet with me, to talk to me about what might come next for me. And of course, I said yes, because I had an amazing group of people. And you know, what happened was that preparing for those conversations really forced me to put some order around, you know, the chaos in my brain at that time. I don't know that I'm doing any of the things that I said I was going to do in 2016. I might not be doing one of them. That's not really the important thing. The important thing is that that offer actually from them actually mandated a kind of focus and clarity. I actually think that should be built into nonprofit practice, where a small committee of the board is there to support the leadership, and not just the leader at the top, but, you know, in general, leadership at the organization, and make it possible to have transition conversations with people as they are moving on to the next thing and the next thing. I think this would be a really beautiful kind of addition to what's expected of a board. I also began to wonder if we should spend more time at the beginning of someone's tenure in leadership roles in organizations talking about the end process, so that it's a lot less awkward when you actually get to you know, the end time. What are the factors that should tell us that it's time for someone to go, that where I can self-assess and say it's getting to be time for me to go, so the organization can plan responsibly. And I have also wondered if we should have term limits. That's another thing nobody wants to talk about.
Thank you, Ruby. That's all. I mean, as we're going through these generational shifts on every level, this leadership transition is really the pathway forward, right? So this is extraordinarily helpful to people on this call. Picking up on something else Shawnda mentioned, both in terms of going back to normal, which you and I talk about a lot. Why would we want to go back to that? And that I love that she said this, the problem is structural while the solutions are individual. So we spoke during our roundtable 2 years ago, insisting we do not go back, and that the way that normal way we were operating with regards to funding has to change. And so you said the question is, what do institutions need? And that philanthropy has failed by not asking that question, by not looking at grassroots. So you mentioned that artists frequently gain success through grassroots community-based structures. So to get away from the scarcity mindset, which has come up in the conversation with Nico and Shawnda, and to get away from the scarcity mindset where the funding doesn't provide what is actually needed for operating capital, which you mentioned, you said that funders should ask, because funders can, as the investors, put X percentage into a self-investment fund. So can you tell me more about this process and why you think it's essential to evolve our systems?
So a number of years ago, I mostly did it out of obligation. I thought, well, I'll just show up for a few minutes and then I'll leave. But it was a workshop on capitalization. And I thought, oh my God, I'm going to be bored to tears. I have never been more interested and engaged and fascinated in my entire life, because it really talked about what kinds of capitalization organizations need in order to be healthy. And I'm going to just go through some of the things that were talked about there that I retained and over these years, and that I think about. What's interesting about this list is it's true for organizations. It's also true for individuals. I'm doing a lot of financial literacy work now with individual artists, and these are the translated to individuals are the exact kind of questions that I'm asking the individual artists or individual leaders that I'm talking to about their own personal finances. So, of course, you need enough predictable income to accomplish your proposed programs. I mean, that is the most obvious one. And if you don't, I would say, what are you cutting? Because again, getting back to the ways we're killing people, the ways we're burning people out, it's way past time to keep doing more with less. That is the worst phrase. We need to ban it from our vocabulary. Many years ago at a Creative Capital workshop, the great Aaron Lansman said, you know what? I think I'm going to start doing less with more. Let's do less with more. Do you have enough money in an emergency fund in case something unforeseen happens? Again, an individual needs this. Of course, an organization needs it. In fact, you could look back at the last X number of years and say, we have really faced emergency after emergency. Whether it's a climate emergency or a funding emergency or a pandemic emergency, we have been in emergency. How much operating capital do you need to feel secure? Is it 6 months? Is it a year? Is it more than that? I remember speaking to someone who runs an organization that has a lot of individual members during one of these tragedies. I can't even remember which one now. He had surveyed his organizations, and very few of his organizations had more than 2 months of operating capital. That's not stability. The third is, do you have a fund for self-investment? Sometimes you have an idea that you know is great, but the potential funders just can't quite see it yet. Either you can't quite articulate it, or it's just not clear what the need is. So sometimes you have to demonstrate the need and the viability and vitality on your own first. So this happened at Creative Capital with our amazing professional development program. We saw that our own artists were informally sharing what they had learned with other artists, with their friends. And I found out about this and I said, well, why aren't we rewarding them for that generosity? This is amazing. We could reach so many more people than we reach with just our, grant pool. So by the time I left in 2016, I think we'd reached like 16,000, 17,000 people all across the country beyond our own grantees. And it had enormous impact. And it spawned a lot of local professional development activities as well. Eventually, we were able to raise significant dollars for its support from a lot of different places, but the Kresge Foundation came in with like $1.5 million to support us over a period of time. But we had to do the demonstration project first. So we couldn't have done that if we hadn't had self-investment capital. Of course, if you have a facility, you need to have a fund for maintenance and repairs. Again, it's sort of a separate bucket. This is how I'm thinking about these things now, as buckets. And of course, then there's the long term. So I don't necessarily think that a small or medium-sized organization needs to have something formally labeled an endowment. Once you're into endowments, there's a lot of legal stuff often in states where, they're following how much you're taking from your endowment and whether you're replenishing it. But it could be a fund that functions the way an endowment functions, so that you don't touch the principal, you're only using the interest. So how might a mid-sized organization build a fund like that over time? But what organizations built these kinds of expenses into their budget requests when they write their grants? And I would say, what if they were required to write those kinds of things into their grants? This would be a dramatic shift because, as we know, so many funders offer only project support, which we know can actually kind of strangle organizations if no one is underwriting operations. So I think that funders should be demanding this kind of capitalization thinking, because this is the infrastructure that over the long term can help to ensure institutional viability and and thriving over time, not just barely getting by.
Love it, love it, love it. Thank you. Thank you. I want to bring up our friends and colleagues, Shawnda and Nico here, and I want to pose a question to you and then open it up to them. And also let's just riff off each other here. I want to see all these faces.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So Ruby, and again, ladies, jump in here too. When you started at Creative Capital, you implemented a 4-part system to be used as what you call the permanent laboratory to think about fundraising. You talked about project, person, community, public. And when you mentioned this in our roundtable, I lit up because the system has what I call the 3 T's: trust, truth, and transparency. So project, person, community, public especially creates transparency. And we know that next era funders yearn for transparency and impact. And this perceived lack of transparency in the arts is one of the reasons they're turning away to other impact-driven sectors. So can you talk a little bit about this system that you implemented and how focusing on these pillars helps facilitate this metamorphosis? And then Shawnda and Nico, jump in.
So when we started in the late 90s, I felt that one of the things missing from the funding landscape was a coherent and holistic support system for artists. This is something, again, that Shawnda mentioned. One that was thoughtfully designed, comprehensive, but also totally flexible and legible to its constituency. So I felt it was important for us to articulate something that was radically different. And given that we were born in that dot-com boom moment, we had venture capital as a kind of commanding metaphor, and my own personal background as someone who had been providing technical assistance to small and mid-sized organizations for decades, I felt that I could see a very practical approach, one that was in fact more designed than anything we'd had in our field. And believe me, I don't know doodly squat about design, but I'll just say a few things about the components of that approach. And I think you'll see how pragmatic it was. In my view, the rubber meets the road on the nitty gritty. That's where, I've often said about organizations that, you can have any kind of thing in your mission statement. Show me where the money goes and I'll tell you what your values are. So the first component is about the proposed project. So we wanted to support the project that someone had shared with us. We did that through both financial and advisory support. I think the way we thought about money was really interesting. The maximum grant was $50,000. Nobody got $50,000 at once. It was parsed out at defined steps along the way. It was like you had an account from us that you could draw on for different purposes. I remain proud of this because I felt it made us good stewards of other people's money. We were really careful about how we dispersed the funds. Several of the grantees that we worked with told me that future grants that they got, they parsed them out to themselves, modeled on the creative capital approach, which I just love. And then the other thing was that we were available to the artists as much or as little as they requested. We didn't have specific check-in times necessarily, but we had sort of benchmarks in the project and people could check in anytime they had a challenge or something they just wanted to talk through. So they had a specific person on the staff that was their person who they could speak with. The second component was to support the person beyond the project. And this is where I think we get a little bit beyond the transactional, right? And where we really cared about people leaving us stronger than when they came in. So this was a lot based on the skills building piece. So we featured things like long-term planning, learning to negotiate, basic financial literacy, thinking about real estate, thinking about marketing, PR, building your own constituency, and so on. And that was a list of skills that just kept growing over time because the external environment changed. When we started, you didn't have to think about the internet. If you had told me I was going to have to hire a social media manager in 1999, I would be like, I don't know what you're talking about. I will never have to do that. I don't know what that is. Anyway, so we had to sort of always be, again, fluid in terms of how we thought about the skills building. The third component was building the community. First, it was connecting the community of awardees with each other so that they would become resources to each other throughout the rest of their lives and careers. And believe me, that has happened. It's a beautiful thing to see. And then connecting the artists with professionals in the arts who could provide useful advice and often opportunities. I could fill the ether today with all of the ways the grantees have supported each other and with the additional opportunities that were created by all the curators, the film exhibitors and producers, the publishers, the performing arts presenters, and so on who attended our retreats. The final component is engaging the public. Since we are not a presenter or producer ourselves, we did this primarily through social media, postings on our own website. And obviously the retreats, which brought a lot of people who have intersections with the public into the room. But a great feature that we added in, this is the last thing I'll say, but it's really important. We offered to convene meetings between the artist and the premiering venue, and the artist controlled the table, who was at the table. The artist talked about what their goals were for the launch of the project. The venue talked about what they were going to actually be able to deliver. I call those meetings rendezvous with reality. And then we were able to step in and say, you have some dollars that you can use for the gaps. And so we helped people really attain their goals, both through clarifying with the venue what they were going to do, but also having additional resources. This was one of my favorite ways to invest in the projects, and the impact of that was phenomenal. So project, person, community, public, I still think it's a great framework. It's really intimate, which I know is one of the reasons a lot of other funders just don't or can't do it. But I think the results speak for themselves.
Thank you, Ruby. Okay, we're all here. Ladies, jump in. Is there anything one of you said you want to respond to? I know we have a lot of thoughts.
I'm like, everything? Can we do everything?
Do everything. We'll go.
I
for
wish
3
that
hours.
the audience could see our panelist chat, because it's like church, we're just in here like, yes. It just feels so good to hear people speak transparently and directly about like what the issues actually are, because that's the only way we're going to like solve any of this stuff, right? And so I'm just so grateful to share this space with you, because I don't know anything about money. I don't know anything about philanthropy. I just know about institutions, and I know that we've all been trained as folks working in the nonprofit sector to like just be grateful for what we get and to not talk about the money aspect. And so I'm just in awe of all of you. So thank you.
Oh, what I love about you ladies is that um, you aren't just like, let's tear all this shit down, right? It's let's dream, let's figure out something new, let's figure out what the shift is, what the shift needs to be, what the upgrade needs to be, and let's build these new and relevant institutions. And you come with these ideas, and a lot of which you articulated to do that and upgrade and make that change and be productive in getting us through the needed metamorphosis.
First, I'm just excited. I'm like, oh, friends, you're all here. This is wonderful. And you're all saying all the things. And I don't have to be the one to say all the things. Like, this is really wonderful. And Ruby, you could just talk for like, for 2 hours and I would have a notebook of notes. So maybe we just do that offline. Quickly, two things that I made notes that I wanted to respond to. The first was Nico. I was really struck by your comment around not being so wedded to seeing the change and sort of needing that instant gratification, because we really live in this instant gratification culture. I was at over the summer, I was at the Whitney Museum and the Whitney Plantation Museum in New Orleans. If you have not been there, you should go there. One of the first museums to the descendants of enslaved people. And I was sort of walking around, some of their exhibits, and they had a section that had the words of actual enslaved people who were interviewed at some point. And at that moment, sort of as someone who, is a descendant of enslaved people, sort of walking around very upright through the front door, sort of this place, I was really struck by the fact that there couldn't have been a way for those people who said those words to have envisioned the power with which I walked through that door. Right. And so in a moment where we can see the need for really deep social and political change, probably in the most like threatening moment that I think that we've ever lived in, we were still in a moment that I was able to walk through that door in all of my power in my red lipstick and really interact sort of with the dreams that I was inheriting from these people. And so I always sort of, I'm like, which dreams am I leaving? Which ones am I investing in? If I were able to go back, what will I be able to say? I've done. So that it just really hit me, sort of in my bones. And I think the next thing, Ruby, to your point, around investing in the whole person and around taking care, and I think you may have said that too, around taking care of yourself. In the meanwhile, part of what I'm doing is making sure, the real shift that we're doing in philanthropy says we can resource wellness, we can resource the ability to be taken care of in the meantime, which is a shift, especially for women and for women of color, non-binary people, queer people of color specifically, that says, wellness isn't a little piece of a reward or a trip to the spa. It has safety sort of inherent in it, sort of economic safety, physical safety, all of those things. And we can start to shift the sector to say, it's our responsibility, to sort of address the harms of philanthropy through doing the work this way. It's an investment in the future. And it actually does a sort of look back that says we haven't always gotten it right. And let's take this moment and sort of do that shift. Again, I could go and go and go, but those were sort of the two things I wanted to offer. Thank you all.
I will say I'm frustrated by the slowness, and maybe it's my age because I'm not going to be around all that much longer. So I really want to see, more change and meaningful change maybe faster than it can happen. You know, I am working on my archive, and it's, I mean, I found stuff that I don't even remember writing or speaking. I really don't. And it's amazing to read some of it now and to see in some ways how little has changed. It's been a little depressing. And I've been thinking about the word lurch, because I feel like we just kind of lurch from crisis to crisis. And we, you know, it's the 2-step forward and 1 step back. But now I'm wondering if it's, you know, 1 step forward and 2 steps back. I'm really concerned about what we're not putting in place that is allowing structure, that is allowing us to build solidly on a structure, so we don't have these going backward moments. There was a really interesting, I don't know if you saw the conversation that Ann Temkin from MoMA and Naomi Beckwith from the Guggenheim had. There's a really amazing quote from Ann toward the end of the conversation. And she's talking about MoMA and earlier times. And she talks about a book that I wasn't familiar with it. Darby English and Charlotte Barrett edited, among others, Blackness at MoMA. The great and heartbreaking lesson of that, she says, was that there were different points during our history when there was focus, just like there is focus right now, and the tide went back. Those big steps forward kept getting retracted. Our job is to make sure that the current moment isn't one more cyclical episode that then gets left behind. That, I think, is the challenge. What needs to be put in place to make sure that our forward movement is truly movement forward?
It's so, yes. And what I'm thinking of as you're saying this is the stats, going back to the stats and the research, right? Which is, we saw arts funding just crater during COVID. I mean, it was awful. We took it, every other sector grew, we took a massive hit, and we'll have more webinars about that. But then we saw a rebound in 2021, and I follow the Giving USA report, and we rebounded in 2021, but we didn't exceed really where we had been. We just sort of caught up, and arts funding still remains at 4% of overall charitable giving in America. We cannot get that number up. And I've been thinking a lot as I've been watching these numbers, and okay, we had these crises in 2020. People diverted their money to social areas of social justice, racial justice, climate justice, and politics, because that was the big campaign, presidential year, right? And we see this money going to other areas that I believe made a better case for their impact and their work in these impact areas, especially around justice. And I would even lump politics into that. And my question is, if we're going from crisis to crisis, lurching from crisis to crisis, like you mentioned, Ruby, which I think we can say is the new world order. Every day there's a crisis, right? So if we see arts funding get diverted every time there's a global crisis, and we're living in a crisis to crisis world, that's even more problematic for our sector when stuff had been dropping, when things were going okay. And now we don't know what the financial landscape will bring for this year. And I think you make a great point, which is, you know, we need to develop a sustainable way to do this work, to message what the impact is, to message how the arts are furthering these areas, impact in these areas of global progress. And we need to do that better and tell those better stories so that when these crises come up, we aren't constantly ignored. I mean, everyone turned to the arts during the pandemic, right? You saw people playing violins on their balconies in Italy. You saw people quilting, all this stuff we were doing, but it didn't seem to register that this is what gets people through, right? And so we need to make a better case for that, because I do think we're living crisis to crisis, and we need to come up with a more sustainable structure, because we can't keep living like this.
Okay, well, I'm gonna end on that note.
my thing just hiccuped. You know, it's been 2 years, almost to the day, of our roundtable, which was January 26, 2020. And we've talked a lot about the problem areas, and we talked a bit about the solutions. To close out our conversation today, because I'm looking at the time, I want to ask you all to talk about what you think has progressed for the good, Let's name something that you've seen that's really changed over the last couple of years and something that you're still focused on. One thing in particular is kind of sitting there nagging you that needs to make that change, and something you could be working on in your advisory work, in your grant making work, in your consulting work. Jump in.
Oh man, are you asking me to be hopeful?
I'm asking you to be a little hopeful, girl, a little bit. Just
I literally wrote hope question mark. Yep. Yep.
I'm reaching really deep, and I think my orientation is toward hope. Otherwise, we would never actually do the work that we do. But it's hard, sort of right now. I think in our current social and political moment. The one thing I would say is I think there are more conversations about wellness, about I think about, one of the things that COVID did was give us this opportunity to reimagine work, to reimagine our relationship to labor and to production, our relationship to wellness, especially for women, for people of color, for our non-binary sort of folks of color, to really re-examine that, sort of fundamental relationship that says our worth and our value is tied to what we produce. And I think that, young folks are rejecting that. And they're rejecting it, sort of, vociferously. And that part makes me be very hopeful. And they really are sort of questioning I don't think that I should have to work myself to my death, to be able to be valuable. They really are, having these questions around sort of what it means, even the NAP ministry, I feel like the NAP ministry, was just kind of a little quiet secret for people who, were snapping them up. But now I think, they are really sort of challenging us around rest and wellness. And I think that the ways that is sort of permeating into the nonprofit sector, to the philanthropic sector specifically, and the ability to have conversations like this, these cross-sector conversations, so that we can start to see the connections between social justice and social change and art, and that we, can redefine what it means to have impact in ways that are sustainable going forward. So those are the things that are hopeful for me. Those are, at the same time, some of the focuses of my work going forward.
Thanks, Shawnda. Ruby, Nico?
So I'm going to start with what's nagging me, because it also gives me hope. So, in my work, both just as person in the world, but as a consultant, I do a lot of work directly with artists. And there's just so many amazing young folks out there that identify as artists that have this really deep desire to build institutions and to build community platforms with art at the center, which I think is a beautiful thing. And I want to support, as much of that as possible. I think the naggingness is that everyone's first step is, 501c3, right? That's how the vision comes to be, which is I just want to be able to get that 501c3 money. And so I want to be a part of developing alternatives to that, especially because the folks I'm working with are young, they're Black, they're mostly women. And, I'm just looking at how boards are constituted in our sector. I'm looking at where that money comes from. I'm looking at all of the issues of dominance and control that come with that kind of governance structure. And I wouldn't wish that on anybody. And so what is the alternative? My husband and I formed an LLC without really, fully understanding exactly all that that's going to entail, but knowing that, 501c3 was not the platform for us. And so how do we kind of work towards, more worker-owned collaboratives and more, models for collaboration that are actually in these kind of business operations? So I'm hopeful because the ideas are there, the desire to serve on an institutional level and scale are there. But maybe it's an education piece. And even for myself, as I'm speaking, I'm I need to know more about what the alternatives are.
Thank you. And we had a question in the Q&A from Herman. We're going to get back to you about research in the museum world that tracks equity pay. So we're going to get back to you on that. Ruby, last thoughts. Hopeful
Well,
or not hopeful?
well, no, I'm excited about what both of my colleagues here have been talking about, and I think, one of the things I used to say at Creative Capital is you can't do your work in the world if you're not taking care of yourself, which is one of the reasons that we put so much emphasis on all of the sort of personal skills, not just the professional skills. So I think that's so important, and it's great that those conversations are starting to permeate. I am so excited, Nico, to hear about all these people who want to start their own ventures. And I think that we do have to look at what the alternative structures are. I don't think that we should be limited by traditional anything. And I think you can be, I ran an organization that was both a nonprofit and a trade association. I didn't understand it for the first 3 years I worked there, but it was amazing because a trade association can do lobbying actually to up to a certain extent. It's a whole different structure, and it represented 5,000 filmmakers, right? So we could go to Congress, we could do certain things that we could not do through the actual foundation. So depending on the nature of what people want to create, I think that there are a lot of possible structures out there, and that excites me that we would be in a period of really great experimentation, and that's what we ought to be in right now. And that makes me incredibly excited for the future because people will learn things from these experiments. Some of them will work, some of them won't work. That's the thing about experimenting, but we'll be iterating. I talked about this in the book. It's like, these are not failures. These are just iterations that help us move on to the next thing. So I'm very hopeful. The younger people that I am interacting with now, oh my God. I mean, if I'd been that smart at their age, I don't know, I would be a whole different person now. They're amazing. And what they're going to be able to accomplish is absolutely exhilarating. So I feel like we're at such an incredible moment. For me, going back and looking at my own history has been, already a revelation. And I look forward to sharing all of that with the world. And hopefully there'll be some useful information there for that, this next great generation of leaders.
That's a wonderful place to stop, although I don't want to stop. So this was our part 2. We're going to come back together for a part 3 before the year is out, because I just want us all on the screen talking, and maybe we'll be in the same place and 2 of us can be in the same video. Wouldn't that be amazing?
That would be very cute.
Well, I want to thank you, ladies. I learned so much from you. I know the audience does. I know people will through the book. And I just want to thank you so much for this incredible discussion. Nico, Shawnda, and Ruby, you inspire me, you energize me, and all the people around you. Thank you for your work and your contributions to this field and all the fields, really. Thank you so much. There have been some great questions from the audience. We're going to reach out to you directly to discuss, but I'm going to wrap up here today. In addition to our panelists, I want to thank Kickstarter for their support of the series. I want to thank the Arts Funders Forum Advisory Board members. I want to thank my AFF partners, Sean McManus, Brett Dobbs, and Hadley Mitchell, who's producing the event today, who are part of M+D. I want to thank Jennifer Joy and her team at Sutton for amplifying the work of the Arts Funders Forum. And I want to thank you all in the audience for joining us today and for your ongoing engagement with Arts Funders Forum and Remake the Model series. Stay connected to us on Instagram, LinkedIn, or via email at info@artsfundersforum.com. And we look forward to our next discussion and letting you know when and where that will be. So thank you all so much. Again, Happy New Year. Take care of yourselves, take care of others, and we will see you soon. Thank you all. Thanks, ladies.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you.